Good day, everyone. I'm Ethan, moderator for this webinar.
I want to welcome and thank our participants for joining us today. Our topic today is do's and don'ts of documenting employee performance, behavior, and discipline. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. So let's get started. Let's first start out by looking at why documentation is so important. Documentation regarding an employee's performance can make or break a manager's ability to discipline, terminate, fairly promote, reward, and recognize employees. Documentation is essential for managers and HR staff. It protects the company. It's the right thing to do for the employee. And then it provides future managers with a record should the employee's current manager leave the organization. Documentation also plays a vital role when we talk about investigations and lawsuits. So when a manager is getting ready to sit down and document a discussion he or she had with the employee, so when a manager is putting together his or her documentation, there are some questions they should ask themselves. First of all, is the document understandable to a stranger? Does the document make it clear why the problem is serious? Is the criticism obvious? If you were to receive the document, would you be able to create an action plan from it? So the bottom line is, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So keep in mind, documentation is the foundation of a company's and an employee's defense in any legal matter. So before you can document behaviors and performance issues, you need to first analyze what those issues are. So I've given you some things to think about as you're analyzing the problems. So there are some best practices and guidelines we should all be aware of when it comes to documentation. The golden rule would be, don't wait until the employee's annual performance review to document the employee's behavior. Best practices. You want to describe the circumstances that made the disciplinary action necessary. Provide the employee with your contact information. A well-written appraisal of performance is really the best way to get an employee's attention and warn him or her that a problem exists and it needs to be corrected. So I've listed some guidelines here that can assist managers and supervisors in doing that. Again, try to end the memo on a positive note. The bottom line is you cannot force an employee to sign. There are also documentation errors and pitfalls we need to be aware of. This is by far the biggest mistake a manager can make, not documenting. Don't go strictly by memory. So now I'd like to talk about subjective terminology used within your documentation versus objective terminology. So I put together some examples of that, and I think that once we read through these, you'll have a pretty clear understanding of why it's a better choice to use objective terminology rather than subjective. I would also like to give you 3 examples of documentation: a poor example, a good example, and what I would consider to be an excellent example of proper documentation. We'll start with the example of poor documentation. So let's move on to example number 2, good documentation. Let's now look at an example of what I call excellent documentation. That would be considered an example of excellent documentation. Employee rebuttals. This question comes up pretty frequently. What happens if an employee disagrees with the write-up? The employee has every right to be able to disagree with the disciplinary or the performance write-up. And there are some steps the employee can take in order to put together a document that disagrees with the write-up. I also want to talk about the formal appraisal process. Really, the bottom line here is everybody within the organization needs to be involved in the process, from your senior execs down to your human resources, your managers, and your employees. So there are various stakeholders within your organization. So let's start with the executive and senior leadership. Also, the manager needs to check in with the employee on the progress toward their goal. And then the employee stakeholder group. Reacquaint yourself with your job description. And of course, human resources is a very important stakeholder. They are tasked with providing training to all executives, managers, and employees on the process. When you're conducting your performance appraisals, you need to be aware of factors that might distort what you're indicating in those appraisals. I mentioned feedback, and this is probably the one area where managers just have the most difficulty when it comes to giving feedback, sometimes even when it comes to receiving feedback from others. Here are some effective methods for providing feedback. So when you're conducting your discussions with employees, there are some tips that can help make this process go a little bit easier. Post-discussion. Sometimes issues are not as cut and dried as we would like them to be. In those cases, we need to conduct a full-out investigation. So if you find yourself in that situation, the goals of an investigation are to be fair and objective. So taking corrective action. The goal of corrective action is to create an understanding of the reason for the action. There are ways the employer can minimize the likelihood of a lawsuit. It's very helpful to have what I call a termination checklist in place. So the first thing you need to do before taking any actions that results in a termination, assess the risks of taking that action versus the risks of not taking the action. Again, getting back to avoiding legal consequences of terminations. Thank you very much. I'd like to again thank our participants for joining us. I hope you found the presentation to be informative and helpful.
Thanks, Deanna. All right,
You're
so participants, that does conclude the session for today. You may all disconnect now. Thank you so much, Deanna, and thank you so much, participants. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.